Thank you for joining us today for part one. Let's celebrate the revised standards. The presentation that you're viewing has been prepared by and is the property of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, MSCHE. Reproduction is expressly prohibited without prior written consent from MSCHE. For permission requests, email MSCHE at president@msche.org. For any questions about an institution's accreditation status, or for additional information about MSCHE's standards for accreditation, requirements of affiliation, policies and procedures, and applicable federal regulatory requirements, you should contact MSCHE staff. Always seek the advice of your institution's assigned Vice President Liaison with any questions specific to your institution. This presentation is not intended as a substitute for professional advice from MSCHE staff, and use of the presentation does not guarantee any specific accreditation outcome. Welcome, and my name is Nicole Beaver, MSCHE Director for Strategic Partnerships and Advocacy, and I'll be one of your presenters for today's event. And now I would like to turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Terrence Peavy, Vice President for Institutional Field Relations.
Good afternoon. I'm Heather Perfetti, President of the Commission, and I want to also acknowledge people behind the scenes that are helping with today's event, including Ms. Rebecca DeHaven and Ms. Vicki Clark, who are helping manage so many moving logistics for us as we watch the number of participants climb here this afternoon, with over 100 of you joining us already. We know others will continue to join us as well. The other presenters here with me today are going to share important information about the standards and where they landed, and I am most appreciative of Nicole and Terrence's commitment to leading this process and being here for all of you today. I get to start the presentation with this slide on your screen, which kicks off with a thank you for all of you. Thank you for being here with us today, and thank you for the time that you took to engage with the Commission throughout this process. All of our constituents were highly engaged and interested, and I want to acknowledge how meaningful that was for us. These are your standards, and we are proud of the work we supported together. For every listening session you attended, for every ounce of feedback you gave, and for the final vote where our presidents stepped up to lend their official voice, we thank you. We had overwhelming support for the standards, with 93% of our presidents casting their vote this time around with these standards, compared to only 58% when we adopted the 2014 standards. This signaled an impressive commitment to the changes that resulted from the review process. And our commissioners send their appreciation to all of our institutional representatives. The Commission voted to approve the standards at our March meeting, and they truly enjoyed seeing the votes before them from such a substantial portion of our membership. By now, you are familiar with the process we used for this review, which remains captured at our website, where we continue to post information. You can now find the 14th edition of the Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation that go into effect on July 1, 2023 at our webpage. As you get your copy, you should know that we will be updating that PDF to embed the evidence expectations that will help you and your colleagues understand the kinds of evidence most helpful to peer evaluators, to the Commission, and to our staff. You will hear more about that later from Terrence and Nicole as they walk you through some of the changes. But I will just note here the importance of the evidence that will be captured in what is to come. While this is grounded in federal regulation and part of our process of retaining the Commission's recognition with the United States Department of Education, The detailing of evidence needed from institutions to inform the work we do is also reflective of what is in our best interests as we all better support the work of accreditation. Institutions, of course, have been providing evidence under the 2014 standards or the 13th edition for years. And we have evaluated that evidence to inform the expectations that will be forthcoming. This reflects our bringing together what we have learned as well as various processes required. This approach will provide to you our most comprehensive and streamlined capturing of how institutions should manage their evidence with us. We're excited not just about the standards, but about this more holistic approach to our work for you and with you. Right now, there is a call for comments asking you to reflect on these evidentiary expectations. And so we're again asking you to tell us what you think. Today's event is not designed to address that, as this is a process still undergoing review. But an event already planned for later this spring relating to the evidence under the new standards will be a great opportunity for you to come back and join us again. The entire process of reviewing and revising standards is grounded in federal regulation, commission policy, but more importantly, are philosophical underpinnings that reflect improvement activities for all of us. Yes, we are required to review our standards to meet federal regulation, but we do this because we hold ourselves to the same principles that are applied to all of our institutions. We too conduct periodic assessment, engage in deep self-reflection, and make improvements so that we can best serve you and our higher education community in the ways expected. Now grab your downloaded copy of the 14th edition of the Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation as Terrence and Nicole continue us along this celebratory journey together. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm pleased to be able to briefly overview with you the key features of the 14th edition of the Standards of Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation. As you review the standards, you will note that though the 14th edition of the standards feel familiar, each and every standard has been touched by this revision. And the two areas particularly that have been recently refreshed are those of the introduction and the requirements of affiliation. To begin with, the introduction has incorporated mission, vision, and values adopted by the Commission and identifies 5 principles that guide the analysis in each of the 7 standards. And these principles include the application of standards within the context of the institution's mission and goals, centrality of the student experience, reflection on diversity, equity, and inclusion, emphasis on data and evidence-based decision-making, and innovation as an essential part of continuous improvement. The updated introduction also included a section highlighting the institution's eligibility requirements in order to reflect the Commission's decision related to domestic and international membership expansion. In addition to the refreshed introductory materials, the requirement of affiliations in the 14th edition have significantly been revised. Under the 13th edition of the standards, you would have navigated 15 separate requirements of affiliation. To eliminate unnecessary separation and duplication, the 11 of the requirements of affiliation have been incorporated throughout the standards, and just 4 remain in the requirements of affiliation section of the document. Beyond the introduction of the requirements of affiliation, each standard has been revised to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to advocate for honest self-reflection that results in meaningful change at our institutions. The standards have also included the verification of compliance for federal accreditation relevant regulations to clarify the connection between the standards, requirement of affiliations, and the basic verification process during the self-study, bringing together multiple processes and documents without additional burdensome reporting. Finally, the Commission staff are developing a document that will map against the criteria and provide evidence expectations under the revised standards. This will identify required data and documentation during the self-study that aligns with the policy and procedures of the Commission, but more importantly, reflect the evidence that institutions and peer evaluators have found most relevant and useful during self-study. As you heard, the Commission has undergone a process of review with the Department of Education, and the evidence is also required as a part of the regulatory expectation too. As you can tell, the standards review process was comprehensive and substantial, and we're excited to share more about the revisions and their implementation today. In Standard 1, there are several changes of note. Within Criteria 1A, the principle of diversity, equity, and inclusion was implemented for its emphasis within the institution's mission and goals. You'll notice within Standard 1, Criteria 3, the goals that focus on student learning outcomes and student achievement, which tie to the guiding principles of data as well as DEI. We will now transition to Standard 2, Ethics and Integrity.
So now as we take a look at Standard 2, Ethics and Integrity, we'll look at some of the key areas in which the guiding principles have been embedded. Throughout Standard 2, Guiding Principle 3, Reflection on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, has been made more explicit. You shared with us the work many of you are already doing on your campuses to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And within the Standards 14th edition, specific language has been embedded within Standard 2, addressing this important principle of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here specifically in employment practices, policies, services, and programs. And of course, all within the context of an institution's mission, because as Standard 2 reminds us, an institution must be faithful to its mission. So let's take a closer look at the standard. Standard 2, Criterion 5, addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion in employment practices with language stating fair and impartial employment practices, including all phases of hiring, evaluation, promotion, discipline, and separation, and adding with appropriate attention to diversity. Criterion 7 of Standard 2 goes on to address DEI as related to policies, services, and programs, but begins by recalling Guiding Principle 1, application of the standards within the context of an institution's mission and goals. Criterion 7 begins by reminding us that, as appropriate to its mission, institutions will have policies, services, or programs in place to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Recalling both Guiding Principle number 1 and Guiding Principle number 3, Standard 2 reminds us that the individual mission and goals of each institution remain the context within our accreditation standards are applied. In addition, you'll also note that Standard 2 Criterion 8 provides an example where verification of compliance with federal accreditation relevant regulations has been streamlined in support of bringing together multiple processes and circumventing additional burdensome reporting. We've heard your feedback, and in incorporating these pieces within the standards, we've worked to avoid duplicative processes. And now we'll take a look at Standard 3.
Within Standard 3, Design and Delivery of the Student Learning Experience, I would like to bring your attention to the following changes. Criteria 1 now has subsections to emphasize the coherent student learning experience, the approximately number of credit hours and other values, and the sufficiency of course content and program length. In Criteria 2C, more detail was added to include all faculty and appropriate professionals. Official publications is inclusive of print and electronic forms of media used to communicate with students. And the phrasing, all student populations in Criteria 4 and 8 is a nod to diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. Next, Standard 4.
So Standard 4, support of the student experience. What's new to Standard 4 in the 14th edition of the standards really speaks to Guiding Principles number 3, reflection on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and number 4, emphasis on data and evidence-based decision-making. In this standard, it was important to insert practices and recruit in Criterion 1 as it embodied the spirit of DEI. It was also crucial for Criterion 2 to have fair and transparent policies and procedures to invoke an inclusive element to reflect all of students. The strategic use of data informed criterion 1E. The standards guiding principle number 4 reminds us that institutions must analyze a range of data, including disaggregated data, to ensure students are appropriately served and institutional mission and goals are met. And institutions should follow the Commission's evidence expectations that are reflective of a range of data considerations, consonant with higher education expectations and consistent with the institution's mission. As we touch on these evidence expectations, it's important to note throughout the standards, it is institutions that define DEI, that define populations, and they must also follow best practices with attention to data integrity and security. So now let's turn our attention to Standard 5.
For criterion 1, we were purposeful in stating institutional and degree program student learning outcomes that should be clearly noted. The data elements involved in criterion 2A and 2B place emphasis on data and evidence of assessment. The same goes for criteria 3, where we ask for the disaggregated results for all student populations. Now, Nicole will take us through Standard 6.
In the development of the 14th edition of the standards, we work to be particularly responsive to the feedback that we received, and that is evident in our penultimate standard, Standard 6, Planning, Resources, and Institutional Improvement. We heard your feedback regarding some of the language used throughout the standards, and Standard 6 includes several clarifications and allows for planning that both integrates goals for institutional effectiveness and improvement, and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. Recalling both guiding principle number 1, application of the standards within the context of an institution's mission and goals, and guiding principle number 3, reflection on diversity, equity, and inclusion, Standard 6 provides clarification of the role of units within institutions. It is also important to clarify the role of related entities, which is now addressed in Standard 6, Criterion 7, with the explanation that documented financial resources, funding base, and plans for financial development, including those from any related entities. Standard 6 Criterion 8 further provides additional clarifications related to financial audits and a multi-year budget. Standard 6 also now addresses planning for diversity, equity, and inclusion that is aligned with the institution's mission and goals. And Standard 6 Criterion 11 further streamlines the verification of compliance with the addition of compliance with program responsibilities under federal Title IV. So now let's turn our attention to our final standard.
In Standard 7, I would like to highlight 4 updates. Within the introductory paragraph, in the first criterion, we have clearly stated language asking for the disclosure of related entities during the self-study process within the standard. Criterion 2H and 2J speak to the avoidance of conflict of interest. In criterion 2K, we ask institutions to make information available to regulatory agencies. And lastly, in Standard 7, criterion 4B, has the guiding principle of diversity, equity, and inclusion, considering the representation of individuals who assist the CEO in fulfilling their roles and responsibilities. As we reflect on the positive changes of the 14th edition of the Standards of Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation, one might consider the influence on the evidence expectation. Please know that Middle States Commission on Higher Education is required by regulation to be consistent in collecting information and collecting evidence from institutions. The evidence that institutions have submitted up until this point form the basis of expectations. We also know that there is some flexibility in the submission of evidence for certain standards that may not apply to certain institutions. We have dedicated a separate webinar on evidence expectations later this spring, where more details will be shared. In the meantime, please visit the website on this slide to view the evidence expectation document. You can review the document and also provide comments for our call for comments, which are available until April 28th. Now I will turn it over to Nicole to begin the Q&A.
So at this time, we would like to begin the question and answer portion of this event. As a reminder, you can continue to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, We have already received several questions throughout the event. So at this time, will we begin with some of those questions? Our first question asks about additional information available on the website and whether or not there's more information about the changes that have been made throughout the process.
I'll give it a shot, and Heather, if you want to add more detail, feel free. The website will be constantly changing. As we just mentioned, we have now the evidence expectations for the membership to review, as well as the new standards. Every week or so, we'll probably send emails or notifications out when changes have been made. But as of right now, we're trying to be dynamic in terms of providing information and keeping everyone informed.
Thanks, Terrence. I'll just add that we do have a planned communication strategy that pertains to the website as well as to keeping all of our constituents informed about the next steps. We recognize that we have several important milestones as we move the standards under this edition forward based on the vote of the commission at the March meeting. And so we're looking forward to sharing more information with you and making sure that you have all of the updated information that would be available to you, whether at our website or being circulated to our key contacts at our institutions. This is probably a good time to make a plug for our institutions to ensure that their key contacts are updated within our database so that as we continue to distribute information, the right individuals at your institution will be receiving those communications.
We have another question. Could you please speak about the requirements of affiliation and their integration into the standards?
So I'll look to Terrence and see if he wants to add anything. I think this was an initial critical component of looking at the way that the 2014 standards and requirements had been structured. What we had heard almost immediately from the institutions that participated in the pilot project to implement those 2014 standards was that the division of the requirements of affiliation separately away from the standards when they were relevant and seeming very tied to the standards got confusing. And so along the way, along the journey with the 2014 standards, we were trying to better understand how to structure the requirements of affiliation in a way that would not be distracting to those that are working on self-study and trying to make sense of the structure of those requirements. And so it became fairly obvious that we needed to think differently about those requirements of affiliation. And as we went through that process, as well as hearing feedback from the many institutions that followed the pilot project institutions, we kept hearing similar sentiments that some of those requirements of affiliation that were so directly tied to the standard should simply be incorporated differently. Terrence, you work directly with institutions, so if you want to talk a little bit more about some of what you heard relating to the requirements of affiliation and how this new approach might be most helpful, feel free to add.
I would say there was a tremendous amount of excitement for the reasons you've cited already. This really concentrates the work of the institutions when they are forming their steering committees and working groups in terms of just having them folded into the standard. So nothing but elation from all the institutions that I've had a conversation with.
Thank you both for sharing that. Another question is, would you please provide guidance for institutions currently in self-study with upcoming fall or spring 2024 peer evaluation visits? Specifically, how should we think about the new evidence as our working groups have just completed their draft reports without the evidence expectations document referenced?
I can start off, and Heather, feel free to chime in. So as of right now, the standards will go into effect July 1st. And we're looking at the cohort that's going into the Self-Study Institute as being the first to implement the new standards. Now, of course, those that are not in that cohort can review the standards and maybe kind of live within the spirit of them, but you are not required, especially those of you that are right now in the middle of the process, to now convert to the new standards that will be starting July 1st. There may be occasions, depending on whether or not institutions fall into a follow-up category or fall out of compliance in certain areas where they may actually have to use the new standards. But I would say in total, those institutions that are currently in self-study will continue on with the standards that they started off with. And of course, the cohort that's going into Self-Study Institute this fall will begin with the new standards. Are there any additional comments?
Thanks, Terrence. I guess I would encourage you, as the evidentiary expectations are being circulated and reviewed, those are available. Look at what has been included. Again, this stems from our experiences with institutions, the evidence that institutions have provided that have allowed for really exceptional evaluations to occur under the standards. And so we're trying to bring that together in a way that would be helpful to institutions. So for those of you who are not yet operating under the new standards, in that you won't be at this fall Self-Study Institute, but you are going through the process, you can certainly use those as a resource to look at the evidence that you intended to collect and provide, and see what helpful information is in there as you wrap up your readiness for your evaluation. But again, as Terrence said, it would not be required. Your team would not be looking for specific items that are reflected in that document moving forward under the 14th edition of the standards, but still lots of great information in there as a resource to institutions currently in self-study.
I think the next question, while we're on the topic of timelines, is an important one. Not sure if you mentioned this, but the website still has the older standards, and when are these going to be updated? And as you can tell from the discussion here, both sets of standards will need to live on our website for a time, because we will still have institutions using both sets of those standards. So at this time, if you follow the link on the main page of our site from the banner, that will take you directly to the 14th edition, but you will still see that the 13th edition are available on our site as we're still having institutions utilizing it. Terrence or Heather, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it's just important to remember that we will be trying to help lessen any confusion through our public presentation of two sets of standards that we know both are critical for different reasons to different institutions. And so we will be updating our website and making sure that it is clear for institutions which standards are applying to them, as well as for our peer evaluators, which ones apply to the visits that they will be supporting on our behalf.
We have another question related to the bigger timeline related to the standards. What is the timeline that MSCHE uses to update standards?
So I will go ahead and add here. You heard that our review of our standards is part of our commitment to honoring our regulations and what we are required to report to the Department of Education. And so we undergo a process for review essentially every 5 years, although we start that far sooner than when that 5-year expiration date occurs. And we do have a policy that requires the review of standards every 10 years. We are going to revisit that to determine if that is still the appropriate timing for reviewing our standards. We get to decide how frequently we evaluate those standards, how the process we use to do that. And so we will continuously be eyeing if the process for review and the timing for review remains appropriate, considering the changes in the higher education community. We certainly want to give our standards some time to settle and let our institutions get used to operating within any changes to the standards. And that has always been the approach of our commission. So we do keep that in mind, but federal regulation does require that we review those regularly.
We have a question related to standard 3 and the disaggregation of student data. What will it consist of? What would the divisions or categories look like?
Well, we will have another session that will dive into that in a much deeper way, but I think we conveyed hopefully the spirit and as to why this is actually embedded in that particular standard. It just allows institutions to look at all populations and be strategic about how those populations are supported. And so again, some examples we'll have formed for you in the later webinar, but again, the intent and the spirit was just that, to allow institutions to really understand the various populations within their institution.
We have a question related to standard 5. Several sub-criteria which focus on examples of the application of assessment results do not appear in the revised standards. Can you speak to the choice to remove those?
Nicole, can you review the question again?
Yep, absolutely. So in standard 5, several sub-criteria focused on the application of assessment results, and they're no longer in the revised standards. Can you speak to those?
I guess I'll kick off and Terrence can add to what his perception might be. I think what you will see in the accompanying evidentiary document is some of the examples that you may have otherwise looked for within the criteria. And so part of that conversation will take place at the upcoming webinar as those data and documents and information points are detailed by standard and by criteria in that document. I can say that the commitment to assessment and evaluation has not shifted within the 14th edition of the standards. And so that remains a critical component of the work at institutions. But I think the later webinar will speak to some of what is now appearing in that document that will help institutions with their assessment and evaluation practices and producing the kinds of evidence that is most helpful. Terrence, did you want to add something more?
No, I agree that the second webinar will do a deeper dive, but I think the intent and within standard 5 was not to take away data, it's really to actually organize data in a better way so that the assessment results can be more evident, and obviously put the institution in a way to use that information to be more strategic. So again, I believe when we have that session in the spring, we'll do a deeper dive in understanding kind of the various elements within that standard.
I have a question regarding JDEI. Since an intentional integration of JDEI is new, will you be sharing examples of best practices regarding data collection and demonstration of JDEI planning and goal setting?
That's definitely the intent for us with regard to first talking more in detail about the changes that we made to the standards, having that companion webinar that kind of goes into the evidence that supports it. And of course, later on this summer, we will dive into to each standard and possibly provide even more information to give guidance to those institutions that will be adhering to the standards after July 1st.
Thanks, Terrence. I'll go ahead and add that we already do this in a number of ways and highlight a few of those. First and foremost, and for those of you who have been through Self-Study Institute, and Terrence can add to this too, we try to connect institutions at Self-Study Institute where they can talk about their best practices, some of their approaches to the work that they're doing, and to the evidence and documentation that they plan to present as part of the self-study process. We also have our wonderful podcast, Pillars of Change, which is already focused on exceptional work at our institutions, and that is also a source of inspiration as well as for best practices for institutions to consider and think about. We also will have a number of webinars like this throughout the fall and spring that are featuring the good work of our institutions, much like we have done for the past several years. And so other webinars can connect institutions around this topic to better inform practices across our higher education community. And then we do have our annual conference. Sorry, Nicole, I know you have an announcement at the end about the annual conference, but we do encourage you to think about what you would like to share at the annual conference. And we do have our call for proposals out for concurrent sessions right now. So we have a variety of mechanisms already in place that allow institutions to share the exceptional work that they are doing and supporting. And we continue to want to hear from all of you on other institutions where you've seen great practices and you want to recommend them to us for a webinar, or you want to signal a model practice that you think is important for others to hear.
So while we're discussing what models we can share and what advice we can give one another, we have the question, what advice would you give institutions that will have an accreditation cycle with the new standards?
Well, I'll take a start and then feel free to add on, Heather. So again, we have vice presidents that are connected to all of our institutions. So I feel you should not necessarily have to feel like you're out there alone. Feel free to contact your vice president liaison to have an initial discussion about some of the thoughts you're having, or even some of the questions that may have come up after reviewing the document. I do feel that every institution should have an internal conversation about the standards, especially with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think one of the things that we try to emphasize today is that that should emanate from your mission and goals. This is not something where I believe us as the commission are saying, this is how we define it for you and you have to follow it. It really has to be well defined within the institution, and we use that as we go through the remainder of the standard. So the takeaway is really to reach out to your vice president liaison when you're able to kind of form some good questions to start that discussion, but also start to have really good conversations within your own institution.
Thanks, Terrence. I will add to that, and that is, as you think about the constituents at your institutions who need these conversations, who need to be updated, who may not be logging in today to hear this or the next webinar, carrying the information back to your constituents is so critically important. And don't forget about your boards. Some of your board members have come to know and understand the commission's standards and expectations. And so updating them, finding a way to include this information in the regular work that they do so that they feel also well-informed and well-prepared for what they may need to know under these revisions will be very helpful to them as well.
We'll continue in that thread of giving advice and best practices. I noticed some of the changes within the standards in assessment. What is the best way for an institution to get started with course level assessment, and how to build a culture of assessment starting at the course level?
So again, I think it's a little bit of what I said in the last answer is really, understanding what has been done at the institution, and of course, looking at some of the assessment information that you've acquired over time, looking at the new standard, and then building some of those core questions of how do we move forward, and how does this impact some of the strategies that we've done in the past. So again, I believe that we can be helpful in some of those conversations, but I think it's really just really understanding the change, if there's any, with regard to how assessment is done at your institution as it relates to the new standards that will be implemented in July.
We have several questions asking about today's presentation and about the materials along with it, and whether they'll be available after this event. And yes, they will be made available after the event. Each of you attending today, including the rest of the MSCHE membership, will be able to obtain a copy of today's presentation. The video will be distributed once the presentation is concluded in about a week from today's event. So you will be able to get a copy of that. We also have some questions about how to access some of the things that we've shared today on our website. And as I shared earlier, you can go directly to our website, and in the banner at the very top of the page, you're able to get right to the 14th edition of the standards. You can also still access the 13th edition of the standards on the website. And then we've had a few people ask us about how to access the evidence guidance document, and you can locate that on our website on the policies page and the policies under review link, and you'll see that that is one of the documents that is under review there. You'll be able to download a copy for your review, and you'll also be able to provide your comments and feedback in that section. So moving on to some additional questions, can you clarify if we would still need to fill out the verification of compliance form as well as present evidence within the standard?
So I'll kick off, and then others can certainly chime in. The document around the evidentiary expectations that you'll hear about at the next webinar is designed to be holistic. And so it is designed to bring into focus what may be necessary under the requirements of affiliation in terms of evidence, and what is required under the standards as well, with federal compliance expectations being incorporated, as well as clarity around references to honoring commission policies and procedures. And what does that look like for institutions and for teams? So it is really designed to bring together a more holistic approach and form and structure for reporting. So the hope is to move away from multiple kinds of reports that have to be submitted and uploaded, and moving more toward evidence that gets captured in the evidence inventory, which our institutions are used to working within. So we are trying to simplify the reporting pieces and different templates and forms that institutions in the past have been asked to consider. But again, this is all still under review. And so we are collecting feedback from all of our constituents, which will inform what the final version of this looks like. Terrence, did you want to add anything more to that?
I think you covered all the points very well.
Another question asks about the additional training that we'll be giving in the near future, and says that they're pleased about the new accreditation standards, but wondering if colleges will receive additional training around these standards.
Well, yes, we obviously have talked a lot about the part 2 to this webinar that is coming up later this spring. So that's, I would say, the complement to this webinar and talking more about the supporting evidence. But yes, we are in the process of planning various trainings just to, again, give the membership an opportunity to bounce new questions off of us. And so we can use that to, help inform how we should train. So still in the process of being developed, but we are looking forward to putting more training out there related to the new standards and the supporting evidence.
And in addition to our institutions, of course, we will train all of our 1,700 or more peer evaluators at this point as well. So as teams begin their preparation to evaluate institutions under these standards, we will be developing the appropriate training for our peer evaluators. And so we have a significant amount of training development that is underway and will continue as we officially move into July 1 under these particular standards and requirements. And we're quite excited to be able to have new training programs for our institutions and our peer evaluators, as well as for our commissioners as well. And so we have training protocols that we are getting ready to move forward. And certainly everyone will be required to understand the standards through those training opportunities.
Okay, our next question asks, does MSCHE offer suggested list of campus officers best positioned to address each standard, realizing that different campuses use different titles for some of these positions?
I would say we haven't gotten to that level of detail with regard to titles and positions, but I would say similar to the way that we've organized standards and work groups in the past, based on the content of the standard, I'm pretty sure institutions can identify key individuals on their respective campus. But definitely not a bad idea, and something that I wrote down to possibly have, as an idea going forward with regard to, at least in general, individuals or positions that should be attached to certain standards.
And I think that's one of the real great pieces of Self-Study Institute. As institutions come together in a cohort to undergo self-study evaluation, there's a significant amount of collaboration. And I've already mentioned how we can connect institutions with those that maybe are facing similar challenges or are similarly situated and have recently been through self-study. So conversations with others in the variety of ways that we support them can also help institutions best structure the way they support the work of evaluation. And so talking with other institutions about how they did it, which drivers of self-study were critical for them, and did they come from specific offices or hold specific titles? That really is part of the beauty of Self-Study Institute and working directly with our vice president liaisons to your institutions. They manage a significant number of institutions in self-study over time, and they can certainly connect you with other institutions that could be helpful in your thinking through the best way to structure. We have a lot of newness coming into different positions at institutions, and curious about the same thing you've presented. How can I best structure this at my institution? And we have tons of veterans and cheerleaders of accreditation who have been through this process several times under different models and could talk with you about the benefits of the various models that your institution could adopt. So lots of great experience in our commission with our staff members, our commissioners, as well as with institutional representatives. You heard me reference the number of peer evaluators. So we have over 1,700 individuals who do this work on the ground with our institutions. So our evaluators are another great source of information as well, especially those who have spent time across a number of different institutions to see the models and approaches to the support of self-study.
So while we're on that topic of newness at institutions, we have a question. We have a new ALO at our institution. How do we update that key contact information?
So that new ALO should either themselves go to our portal to update that information, or if there's a key contact on campus that has access to the portal, to go there to actually update so that the new ALO's information can be displayed on the website.
And I have to put a plug in because I know we have an ALO event in May, I think. And so if you are a new ALO, I would encourage you to look at our events and see what events are specific to your role. We also have policies and procedures that are very critical to the work that our ALOs support. And I will certainly take this opportunity to thank all of you who serve as our ALOs, because we recognize how important you are to the work that we do and how important you become to us when we need to communicate directly with our institution. So thank you to our ALOs.
All right, our next question relates back to the data. Will the commission be willing to accept disaggregated student data with redactions for small cell size?
So I think I'm going to defer, and I know people have a lot of questions about the kinds of data and evidence that we might be looking for under some of the new criteria. I think that is best reserved for the next event. because the presenters will be prepared to answer these kinds of questions for you and talk through some of the areas that we know continue to cause concern for constituents, and they are preparing to answer those questions for you at that event.
I have a question here that says, I'd love to have a conversation about these changes on my campus. Will there be resources made available that we can use for talking points? And I'll kick us off here. As I shared earlier, following this event, this video will be made available, and that certainly is a good place to begin as well. Also, I would direct your attention to our website. The link that we've shared with you today to direct you to the 14th edition of the standards takes you to our standards revision process page of our website, and it walks you through all the stages of the process that have gotten us to this point, and we will continue to make resources available there as well. Heather, Terrence, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, the resource I've been touting, at least for the question and answer session, are the vice presidents. So feel free to reach out to your vice president liaison, and they would actually be a valuable resource as well.
I would just add, for institutions that will be going through self-study under the 14th edition of the standards, will have plenty of resources available to them, not only through the vice presidents, but also through the materials that have always been developed to help institutions support their self-study journey. If you have ideas about the kinds of resources that would be most helpful to you and to your colleagues, I would encourage you to send those to us, and you can certainly send them to president@msche.org. And we will get them to the right individuals to consider that kind of resource. We are going to be building a resource repository as we move forward, and all of these different pieces will be made available to institutional representatives. But we certainly want to hear from you on what you think would be most helpful as you work with constituents to help introduce them to these standards, as well as to support the work of accreditation moving forward under them.
I think we may have time for just maybe one more question. This question asks about the new institutions that could potentially be joining our membership. It notes that MSCHE is an institutional, not a regional creditor, so we could anticipate that institutions outside of our traditional geography would be wanting to join us. And so do you anticipate that our new DEI criteria will change some politicians' pushback on colleges' DEI initiatives?
I think I would need a little bit more information to do a deeper dive, but I think it speaks to what we're sharing in this presentation about defining what DEI may be to your institution and working along those lines. And of course, I think for possibly international institutions, this may be a different concept than those institutions that are here in the United States. But those are conversations that we're willing to have in order to better understand what the challenges may be in terms of understanding that concept.
Yeah, I think what I would add is that obviously our commission is paying attention to the political environment and some of the political pressures that are influencing some states more significantly than others. But what you have seen from our commission is a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, this is stemming from our membership. And membership with our commission is voluntary. And whether institutions consider our commission, one of the very first important conversations that we hold with prospective institutions is about our standards and our requirements. And so any institution that might be considering our commission as its institutional accreditor will understand what our expectations are, and will understand the philosophical principles that guide our work. And so they see that very clearly, especially in this 14th edition of the standards, with the front pages detailing the principles, as well as then with the criteria. I think we are very proud of the work of our institutions. We are proud of where these standards have landed following many conversations that have been held with a variety of constituents. And so I would just note that we are paying attention to the changing higher education landscape, and our commission has been on record for many years stressing the importance of our work in the DEI space.
So as we shared with you throughout the event today, we do have quite a few things planned in the future to help you better understand the standards 14th edition. So as you can see, there is a QR code on the screen before you. And if you take out your mobile device and snap a picture of that, where that will take you is to the registration for part 2. What do I include? Documenting compliance under the revised standards. And at that site, you'll be able to register for the next event in our series, which will take place on May 23rd. In addition to that, throughout the fall, there will be a series of events addressing the standards, and you will find that our standards materials are embedded through many of our fall events. So be on the lookout for future communications about the MSCHE fall series of webinars and events. If you are not receiving notifications of our events or other things happening at Middle States, please do head to our website, msche.org, and sign up to receive notifications from MSCHE. You can also note that heading into the fall, we'll be taking a look at Self-Study Institute 2023. And so the institutions that will be included in that will be notified in the near future. And also, keep looking out for December. You'll see the registration materials head your way for our annual conference, which will take place December 4th through 6th, 2023. Again, we'll be returning to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So we hope that you will add that to your calendar and join us in December in person for other opportunities to learn more about the new edition, the 14th edition of the standards. So at this time, we just want to thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future events.